Dear compatriots of the diaspora, in the first lecture we covered in brief outline the early years of the history of Cyprus up to the end of the 19th century, the first 30 years or so of British rule. In this second lecture, we are going to examine in greater detail the rise of nationalism, the Enosis movement, the EOKA anti-colonial struggle and independence. Then follow the troubled years of the 1960s to the Turkish invasion in 1974. These were sad and tragic years that have left their mark on Cyprus and its people. These are the three main themes of today's lecture. We start with showing the raising of the British flag. This is the arrival of the British on the island after they had taken over the island's administration from the Ottomans in 1878. These are some of the main events we are going to be looking at. The takeover of Cyprus in 1914, the annexation of Cyprus by Britain. 1915, this was an interesting development. Britain offered Cyprus to Greece. Then we have the Treaty of Lausanne. And in 1925, Britain declared Cyprus a crown colony. The Greeks of Cyprus welcomed the change from Ottoman rule to British rule. It was for them a change from the Ottomans, 300 years or so of Ottoman rule, to British rule, feeling that they were now under a more civilized nation, and they approached the arrival of the British with expectations that Britain would help unite Cyprus with Greece, as was the case with the Ionian Islands in 1864. The attitude of the Greeks of Cyprus on the arrival of the British is seen both in the welcome of Bishop of Gideon Kyprianos, who welcomed the High Commissioner, and subsequently the welcome of Archbishop Sophronios in Nicosia. Both expressed their pleasure, satisfaction that Britain was taking over, but at the same time indicating that now it was a time for Britain to look into the issue of union, enosis of Cyprus with Greece, which in what they stated was the desire of the Greeks of Cyprus. This is again an indication of the spirit that prevailed in these early days of the arrival of the British. This is the blessing of the British flag in Nicosia, and it was in all, as you can see, a celebratory atmosphere. This is the first British High Commissioner, Sir Garnet Wolseley, who arrived taking over what in many ways was a backward island. As we described in the first lecture, the vast majority of the inhabitants, the Cypriots, both Greeks and Turks, were poor, illiterate peasants, and there were pockets of middle-class merchants, professionals, and so on, mainly in Nicosia, Larnaca, and Limassol. We covered in the first lecture in greater detail the early measures taken by the British administration to start improving both the administration, the infrastructure, justice, agriculture, life in the villages. So these were soon to create better conditions and a gradual improvement in the lives of the Cypriot people. The first signs of this recovery was the steady growth of the middle class in a better environment where they were freer to get involved in activities like trade, with the professionals in their different fields. In education, it was now easier for the Greeks to establish schools, and education would gradually begin to spread. So there was overall a climate of change to the better. This relative prosperity led to more young people going abroad for higher studies. This was mainly to Greece, to study, either to become lawyers, to study law, medicine, and theology, and to become teachers of Greek language and so on. Now, spending a few years in Greece, on their return, they were infused with national ideals, promoting the desire for union with Greece. This is characteristic when we see the names of some of the protagonists in the events later on in the century, where the one thing which they had in common in their background was that they attended university in Greece. They went there already feeling with these feelings of nationalism and so on, and through their studies and their life in the metropolis, this became even stronger. So the growth of nationalism amongst the Greeks of the island was to determine the course of events and shape the history of the island for the most part of the 20th century. Although the colonial administration established the Legislative Council in 1878, which was subsequently revised in 1882 and 1925, it provided little say and participation to the Cypriots, who did not feel that they were actually in control of their affairs. Taxation was an issue that was aggravated by the tribute controversy. This was the tribute imposed on the people of Cyprus, and which was used to pay the Ottoman debt. Gradually, the Greeks were becoming increasingly restless, affected by feelings of nationalism, and this was to lead to a series of events in the next 50 years or so that would culminate, for different reasons, to the Declaration of Independence in 1960. There was a kind of pause in this development of this nationalist feeling and nationalist activities during the First World War. Certainly under conditions of war, it was not easy to promote the idea of enosis and the desire of the Greeks of Cyprus to unite, to join with Greece. It must be said that in 1915, Britain offered Cyprus to Greece in return for Greece entering the war on the side of the Allies, something which was not taken up. The king, mainly, of Greece was not so keen on getting Greece involved in the war, mostly because of his connections with the German monarchy. He was of German descent and so on, but overall what was used as a reason was that Greece was not ready to go to war and preferred to follow a policy of neutrality. This event is significant in the sense that we don't know what would have happened. If Greece had entered the war, would the British have subsequently honored their offer? If they did, then a lot of things would have been different. If they didn't, the situation would have become worse on the island. But these are the ifs of history, which nobody really has an answer, but only speculations. 1919, with the Treaty of Versailles, this made the arrangements for the end of the war. The Prime Minister of Greece, Eleftherios Venizelos, attended, but he did not raise the question of Cyprus. Venizelos' priorities regarding certain territories which he wanted for Greece, he felt that in order to succeed in his policy, he needed to be on good terms with Britain and France, and especially with Britain. He was not so confident that raising the issue of Cyprus would not produce a result, but possibly strain these relations. Then there followed the war in Asia Minor, which started successfully for the Greeks, but ended in disaster and the loss of territory in Asia Minor. The Treaty of Sevres followed, which really made the arrangements after the war, or the First World War, regarding the area. But what is key is the Treaty of Lausanne, which had specific clauses regarding Cyprus. We're going to look at this in a minute. And just to conclude with that, in the 1925, Cyprus became a crown colony. some of the main provisions of the Treaty of Lausanne affecting Cyprus is that Turkey accepted the annexation of Cyprus by Britain in 1914. Turkey gave up any claims on Cyprus, and the Turks of Cyprus could gain British citizenship, but they were also given the choice that they could leave within a period of two years, leave Cyprus and go to Turkey, where they would become Turkish citizens. This is what, in a way, now cut completely the links between the state of Turkey, established in 1923 by the Turkish leader Kemal Atatürk, and Cyprus. The early arrangement of the Cyprus Convention and so on, whereby the British had taken over the administration of the island, leaving sovereignty to the Ottomans, came to an end. Cyprus was now a crown colony, like the many other British colonies scattered all over the world. The end of the war, the arrangements that followed, as we have seen, the Treaty of Sèvres, the Treaty of Lausanne, brought a kind of return to normality, and the re-emergence of this nationalism amongst the Greeks of the island. This is evident in the many societies, associations that began to appear, all stating in their objectives the promotion of enosis with Greece. There was more activity from educated young lawyers, teachers, that were gradually returning to Cyprus, and therefore overall this demand that Britain should proceed with granting the people what would soon become self-determination, which would lead to enosis. The issue of taxation, the tribute, and enosis, the desire for enosis, created tension between the Greeks of Cyprus and the British administration. We can see this progressively from after the end of the First World War, certainly more so after 1925, when Cyprus became a colony. Although the British administration tried to appease in a way the Greeks of Cyprus, in 1925 they revised the composition of the Legislative Council in a way that reflected the proportion, the ratio of population, Greeks, Turks or Muslims, but still the Greeks with their feeling, their nationalistic feelings, the desire for enosis, considered this as not substantial. They actually referred to this council as a toy council. And in 1927, in 1926, they voted against the budget for 1927. And this created a tension. Behind all this was some new taxation plus the tribute. This increased agitation, and it was to lead to the event of October 1931, the October Rising, which occurred on the 21st of October. This began as a protest rally against taxation, but nationalist elements moved in and turned this into a nationalist demonstration that turned violent. One of the persons responsible, Nicodemus Milonas, Bishop of Gideon, he actually issued a declaration announcing the union of Cyprus with Greece, and it was a kind of polemic urging the Greeks to press on with their demands. The Greek Prime Minister, Venizelos, was not happy with these developments. In actual fact, he was not a party to what was happening and did not support the uprising, which was rather easily put down. Venizelos was criticized at the time by the sort of right-wing nationalistic press on the island. Limited as it was, it expressed the view that Venizelos did not live up to the expectations of the Greeks of Cyprus, and there were some that went as far as describing him as a traitor. Now, Venizelos had a different view of the situation. He was still part of the policy that he wanted to have good relations, especially with Britain and France as the Western allies, but had been in some kind of discussions with the British about the possibility of Cyprus being united with Greece, but he was moving very, very cautiously. This is Nicodemus Milonas, the Bishop of Gideon. Now, the uprising was easily crushed. These demonstrators, those who participated, were not really well organized or ready, equipped and so on for this to be successful. The British soon got control, and we look at now the results of this uprising. They actually burned down Government House. They managed to get into the courtyard of Government House, which they burned down. The result was that the Bishop of Kyrenia and some others who were recognized and as amongst the leaders were arrested and exiled to London. The constitution, which had been granted the municipal council, the legislative council, were abolished. And a special tax was imposed on all Greek Cypriots, something like 35,000 sterling pounds, which was the estimated cost of the damages to government house, and which they were going to use to reconstruct it, rebuild it. Soon after this, a new governor, Palmer, took over, and the period he was there and a number of the measures that were enforced gave a kind of name to this period as Palmer's dictatorship. The British were going to pursue a policy aimed at undermining and crushing Greek Cypriot nationalism. And for this, they took a series of measures. They introduced censorship. All political organizations were prohibited. The Communist Party was outlawed. Primary education came under colonial control, and teachers were appointed and paid by the colonial administration. In other words, they became civil servants. So the colonial administration had in this way now control of primary education. There was an attempt to secure control of secondary education, but this met with strong resistance from the church and other Cypriots, eminent Cypriots in the community who resisted, and the British administration did not proceed with that and was not successful. But in primary education, we see that they established a teachers' training college, which was run by the colonial administration. The teachers, the trainees, all had to learn English. They were taught a lot of the subjects in English and so on. So this, I will explain further later, how it fitted into the overall policy of the colonial administration. They prohibited the teaching of history, which at the time was really a history of Greece. And the Greek national anthem was prohibited. The use of the Greek flag was prohibited. The British were actually trying to cut off the Greeks of Cyprus from Greece and create a Cypriot identity. This was a conscious effort. It was a policy, and it aimed at undermining the movement for enosis. This is also evident in the fact that they traced down a number of Greek teachers who had come over from Greece at a time when there were not enough teachers, mostly in secondary schools, and these were also very active in promoting the idea of enosis, and they were rounded up and expelled. They were supposed to return to Greece. So the idea was to make the Greeks of Cyprus turn away from Greece, and in this way the British believed that the nationalist movement would die down. This policy of strict government control what, as I said, has been described as Palmer's dictatorship, was to continue until the outbreak of the Second World War. When the war broke out, again the priorities changed, as was the case during the First World War. This affected also the Greeks of Cyprus, the Greek Cypriots, especially when Greece entered the war. In 1943, Prime Minister Winston Churchill visited Cyprus and promised a change in British policy if the Cypriots helped in the fight against Nazism. This was a policy of the British government trying to enlist the support of the colonies in this struggle against German Nazis. In Cyprus there was support, especially, as I said, because of the fact that Greece was in the war, and many Cypriots volunteered and joined the Greek army, and many joined the British army. The British set up a regiment. And something personal at this point, my father at the time was one of these volunteers who joined the British army, and went with the Cyprus regiment to Egypt, Italy, and so on. When the war ended in 1945, the Cypriots saw their hopes and aspirations ignored. There were promises that there would be a new era of freedom, of self-determination, and for the Greek Cypriots, self-determination meant inevitably union with Greece, because this was the desire of the Greek Cypriots. This is the emblem of the Cyprus regiment that was used when the volunteers joined the regiment and trained very quickly to offer support to the British army. We're now going to look at the events after the Second World War that would lead to the EOKA anti-colonial struggle, which is really a very important stage in the course of events regarding Cyprus in the middle of the 20th century. The British, realizing that this nationalistic feeling was re-emerging, realizing that at some point some promises were made an attempt at conciliation by establishing what they called a Consultative Assembly that was to draw up a new constitution for Cyprus. Here we see some of the signs of divisions amongst the Greek Cypriots that at a later stage would cause considerable harm to the cause of the Greek Cypriots and to the island. There were divisions the right-wing nationalists under the leadership of the church, headed by the church, immediately rejected any involvement in this. They, in their view, they saw this as a ploy of the British, and they stayed firm in that the aim was self-determination, enosis, union with Greece. The left-wing elements at first indicated and participated in the early stages of this assembly. However, this division and the political exploitation by the right, that these were collaborators, they were abandoning the idea of enosis and so on, had an effect, and at some point the left wing, the representatives of the left, also withdrew from the assembly. Now, again, this is a stage where it's not easy to know what would have happened. Looking at some of the provisions of what was intended to develop, it could have provided a slow development towards achieving union. There was the aim, or the British aimed at giving more authority, autonomy to the people of Cyprus. This assembly that was to be established with the new constitution that was being proposed would have greater control over the economy, over taxation, and there was indication that the British would be satisfied at this stage with control of defense and foreign policy. And there was also an indication that there would be a period of 10 years where these arrangements would be re-examined. Well, for some, knowing what happened later, this may be seen as a lost opportunity. On the other hand, if we examine this in the context of the prevailing atmosphere in Cyprus at the time, we see, first of all, that the Greek Cypriots were divided. Second, there was this suspicion and apprehension as to whether the British would honor any promises, and whether actually what was being, in a way, to be promised, whether it would be delivered. So they rejected this whole proposal. It was in its early stages. It had to be worked out. But anyway, it was killed from the very beginning. Now, for the Greek Cypriots, the policy, the attitude they were going to follow was self-determination, enosis, nothing else. In January 1950, under the leadership of the church, a plebiscite for enosis was organized. And this was done outside churches where sort of table was arranged with these big books where people signed and so on. This is what it looked like. The period of the plebiscite, 15 to the 22nd of January 1950, and you can see the Greek flag, and we say, we demand the union of Cyprus with Greece. And they wrote their name and surname, and these were eventually collected. And we could say that about almost 97% supported union with Greece. So this, with all the limitations that one might say, okay, it was open, it was outside the church, whatever influences there might have been, led some to question the validity of the sort of 97%. Another view, however, a more moderate view, is that whatever this might be, it does not change the fact that the big majority of the Greek Cypriots wanted union of Cyprus with Greece. Whether it was 97 or 90 or 85 or 80, whatever, the fact was that this is what, at the time, what they wanted. In October 1950, there was an event that was really to mark the history of Cyprus for the next 27 years or so. The Bishop of Gideon was elected Archbishop Macarios III. So this was going to be a new chapter in the history of the island, considering what we will examine, the personality and the contribution of Archbishop Macarios. We see that the church had played a crucial role in the failure of the British attempts at a settlement with some autonomy to the Cypriots. The church and the right wing in general demanded self-determination and union with Greece. There were now attempts at internationalization of the Cyprus issue. The Turkish Cypriots followed with apprehension these developments. Some of the Turks, the Muslims, had left in the early days of British takeover, but the rest who remained gradually attached themselves to the British, feeling that this was the safest move for them, something which, as we shall see, British policy was to exploit. Now, about the result of the plebiscite, a delegation went to Greece to present the results of the plebiscite to the Greek government, and the delegation went to London to present the results and explain the desire of the people of Cyprus, the Greek Cypriots, for union with Greece. the Greek government was very lukewarm in responding. Greece faced problems that made the Greek government reluctant to get involved. Greece had come out of the Second World War, which had had serious consequences, economic and other. This was followed by the Civil War, 1946-49, very destructive, had weakened Greece in every respect, and was surrounded by states that had become communist. They were under communist control. And this was for them a threat, which meant that they needed the support of the Western powers, Britain primarily, which was a key player in the area. In actual fact, the British were involved in the Civil War on the side of the right-wing forces, which defeated the communists. And there was this dependence. The United States was beginning to make its presence felt, and this was really the reality of the situation, that the Greek government did not feel that it was in a position to challenge and create a rift with Britain, with the United States, and the NATO powers. Therefore, it did not respond. In London, the delegation was equally unsuccessful, and the delegates returned to Cyprus disappointed that their aims were not furthered in any way. And these are the factors that had to explain how gradually we move to the decision for an armed struggle, decision to establish EOKA, and actually fight British colonial rulers. There was an attempt, as we said, to internationalize the problem. I think when one looks at the details afterwards of the records, the documents, and so on, one can make the following rather general observations. One is that there was certainly tremendous enthusiasm and belief in the ideal of union with Greece. This cannot be doubted. On the other hand, this leadership, both the leadership of the church and the few sort of political leaders that were beginning to emerge, underestimated the strength of British diplomacy. They did not have a clear and full understanding of the international situation, of the power struggle that had developed around In other words, we will be moving into the period of the Cold War. There was NATO, the Western powers, organizing themselves militarily to defend Western democracy, Western values against what they consider was Soviet authoritarianism and Soviet expansionist policy. In this context, it was not going to be easy for the Greek Cypriots to achieve their objectives with a Greek state that was not really in a position to offer any specific and substantial support. In 1954, the Greek government took the Cyprus issue to the UN. British diplomacy and her diplomatic activities gradually killed this initiative. It could not produce any decision that was unfavorable to Britain. Archbishop Macarios, in the role now of the ethnarch, and I'm sure it is well known that in Cyprus history, for centuries, since Christianity had made its appearance, the leadership of the church played a leading role in all matters of life of the Cypriot people. This was evident in the period of Byzantine rule. It became more evident during Frankish and Venetian period, where in spite of the persecution of the church was really the unifying force that kept the people together, kept language, religion, customs, in a sense, the Greek identity. Through this, which was subsequently recognized also by the Ottomans, who tried to strengthen the church for their own reasons. So the church overall played this important role. And now it had, as archbishop, as its head, a young, charismatic cleric who was beginning to make his presence felt both within Cyprus, in Greece, and one might say even amongst the British circles who began to look at him with concern. Macarios had started contacts in Athens with those that were ready to embark on an armed struggle against the British. After consultations with key figures there, the decision was taken that this was the route to be followed, the policy to be followed. It was their firm belief that Britain would not offer self-determination and enosis to the Cypriots unless it was forced to. And this was therefore the necessity for an armed struggle. I stress this because subsequently, and in the light of later events, there are those who debate this, whether it was a wise move to start an armed struggle, whether some other policy would have been more successful. But, of course, we must always bear in mind that it is always easier to use hindsight and be critical or appear to be wise. In the circumstances and the atmosphere that prevailed in Cyprus at the time, this was the general feeling, and it was demonstrated by the support of the Cypriots, the Greek Cypriots, to the EOKA struggle. So in Athens, the decision was taken to go ahead. Macarios would be the political leader of this struggle, and George Grivas, the military leader. George Grivas was a Greek Cypriot. He had gone to Greece as a young man, trained, joined the Greek army, became an officer and so on. And he, in some respects, he was a controversial figure for the left, and that would explain why Akel, the Communist Party, reacted in the early stages of the struggle, anti-colonial struggle, and for which he has been accused of not supporting the struggle against Britain and British colonial rule. This is a very big issue that is still being debated, because it is a fact that subsequently many members of the party, but as well as sympathizers in the wider population, supported the struggle. These are the two men that were to play a leading role: Archbishop Macarios as the political leader, and Georgios Grivas, who was to get the nickname Digenis, from the medieval hero from Byzantine times, as the leader, the military leader of EOKA. And this leads us into the outbreak of the anti-colonial struggle in 1955. The 1st of April 1955, the first bomb explosions marked the beginning of the armed struggle. At first, the British thought that these were the actions of a small group of fanatical elements that would soon be brought under control, and that the whole thing would be over within a few months. They underestimated in this respect the support that EOKA, the organization that was formed to fight the British, they underestimated the support that they would have from the people at all levels, in the cities, in the countryside, old people, middle-aged people, young people, men, women. So the conflict escalated. The British began to take emergency measures that in actual fact meant arrests and detention without trial. Eventually it would lead to, these policies would lead to executions. Here we see student demonstrations, which is the evidence of the sort of Catholic participation of the people. One can see the Greek flags and the expressions on faces of these young boys say a lot. This is one of the detention camps set up by the British, where all who were suspected of being involved in some kind of activity related to EOCA were summarily arrested and detained here without any formal procedures, without appearing in court. So the situation got worse in that the measures taken by the British colonial administration brought a lot of suffering. On the British side, the policy was explained in that these were terrorists. Whatever EOCA was doing was sort of terrorist activity, and therefore necessitated this course of action. It's again another scene in Nicosia after an incident where British soldiers and so on are searching civilians. This is very characteristic of what I had said earlier, or explains what I had said earlier about the feelings of the Greek Cypriots at the time regarding Enosis. This one says, «Την Ελλάδα θέλουμε και ας τρώγουμε πέτρες», meaning we want Greece even if it means that we eat stones. I think that says a lot, especially written by, one consider some spelling mistakes and so on, that this was a genuine expression of feelings regarding Enosis. Ναι, γεννηθήκαμε και θα πεθάνουμε Έλληνες. Yes, we were born and we will die Greeks. Again, the Greek element which sort of led to this enthusiasm that this was a national struggle, a just and fair struggle for union of Cyprus with Greece. This is in the courtyard of the central prisons in Nicosia. These were a number of the young EOCA fighters who were caught by the British authorities, were executed by hanging, and they were buried in this courtyard because the British authorities did not want them to go back to the villages or to the communities for the funeral, where this might create strong feelings and further unrest. This is now a national monument. What you can see is it has been looked after and so on, and it is a reminder of those days of the struggle. The fighting, the conflict went on into 1956, 1957, and gradually the British government realized that this was not going to end so easily. It was becoming costly, both in terms of human lives, British soldiers and getting killed, but also economic losses. So attitude and policy began to change. The British diplomacy gradually turned towards the idea of establishing a republic. They would not accept a union with Greece. In actual fact, in their effort to bring the situation under control, they used both the Turkish Cypriots, who naturally were afraid and apprehensive of what the Greek Cypriots might be doing if enosis was achieved. They involved Turkey to stake claims in Cyprus to counterbalance Greece. The unfortunate thing was that internally it created conflict between the Greek Cypriots and the Turkish Cypriots. It created, in actual fact, in some cases, even hatred through the violent events that occurred during these years that involved people from both communities, something which later would be a problem in the early years of the Republic. So the British, moving into 1958, they began to steer a policy which they were ready to consider granting independence to Cyprus, and negotiations began with involving the British Foreign Secretary, the Greek Foreign Minister, and the Turkish Foreign Minister to begin to work out a kind of solution that would create the Republic of Cyprus. Here we see the warm welcome of Archbishop Macarios in Nicosia. Archbishop Macarios had been exiled to the Seychelles by the British to keep him away from the people of Cyprus and the influence he exerted. He was at some point released, went to Athens, but was not allowed to return to Cyprus until the sort of solution to the Cyprus problem of the time was more or less ready. And here he was greeted by thousands of Greek Cypriots. This is General Grivas, again, was at the end of the conflict. He came out of hiding, and it was part of the agreements that were made at the time that he would not stay in Cyprus, and he was to leave and go to Greece. Something that disappointed both him and his supporters, that such an arrangement would have been agreed to. The agreements that more or less established the Republic of Cyprus are known as the Zurich-London Agreements, and they were a painful compromise for the Greek Cypriots. The negotiations were originally carried out in Zurich, so the first they were worked out there, and these were presented to Macarios. There is some controversy here whether Macarios had seen an an early version and did not seem to react to that. But the fact was that he was presented with this while he was in Athens, before he was allowed to return to Cyprus. And Macarios had asked for an extension so that he could consult with the leadership, in a way, with eminent Cypriots that formed the Ethnarchy, which was a sort of council that advised the Archbishop. And he then went to London, and the various personalities from Cyprus also went there. And there was a meeting at Lancaster House. Macarios at first approached the whole thing in that he was going to try and bring about changes to the agreement that was worked out at Zurich. However, very, very quickly, he was stopped, because the British put it very, very clearly that they were there to sign and not to negotiate anything further. The Greek government, represented by Foreign Minister Averov, shared this view, in that he actually put pressure on Macarios that these agreements had to be signed, otherwise Greece would not, the Greek government would not get involved in whatever might happen afterwards. The British were actually threatening that there would be more bloodshed, that Turkey might get involved, and so on. So, in the end, the agreements were accepted, and this formed the basis of for the establishment of the Republic of Cyprus. I say a painful compromise for the Greek Cypriots. In what respect was this painful compromise? First of all, it brought the idea of enosis to an end. It was now Cyprus was going to be a republic. This other thing is contained in the actual agreements and the constitution that was eventually worked out. There, in the negotiations that took place and the compromises that were made the Greek Cypriots feel that they were unfairly treated, in the sense that the population ratio at the time was like 80% Greek Cypriots, 18% Turkish Cypriots, 2 to 3% things vary here a little. There were the other small groups, the Maronites, the Armenians, and the Latins, who very early stated that they opted to join the Greek Cypriot side. So together they made about 82%, as opposed to 18% of the Turkish Cypriots. Nevertheless, in the constitution it was stated that For example, positions in the civil service and so on would be shared 70 to 30%. This was the ratio also in the high political positions. It was also in the police force and the small military force that was going to be set up. The provision was for 60-40, something which made the Greek Cypriots feel bitter that this was disproportional. On the other hand, the Turkish Cypriots gained a number of things which gave them some advantages, and of course, naturally, they would be reluctant to abandon. This put the seeds, really, for the future conflict between the two communities. This constitution that was eventually officially established, because after the Zurich-London agreements there were a number of pending issues that were worked out, and the constitution was finalized. It's a very peculiar document. It has been the subject of very controversial, opposing interpretations. I can give you only some examples. The constitution stated that the president would be a Greek Cypriot and the vice president would be a Turkish Cypriot. The vice president would have the power of veto. The ministries were shared in the proportion that I mentioned earlier. One could go into more and more details. For me, the important thing is not the actual weaknesses that one might have seen in the constitution. One could say that, okay, under the conditions that prevailed, the pressure to find a solution and so on, there were some weaknesses which could be put right. I think the most serious thing is that the way that it was structured, and I think this was deliberate policy, it would not allow the two groups, communities, to get closer together and, for example, in the long term, possibly see the development of a state of a different kind. What do I mean by this? There were implanted in the constitution restrictions which could not be modified, they could not be amended, that would keep the two communities apart. For example, in the absence of the president, who was a Greek Cypriot, he was sort of substituted by the leader of the House of Representatives, who was a Greek Cypriot. One would say, why not by the vice president? And you can go through and you see built in these elements that it would keep the two communities separate. And this together with the suspicion, the hard feelings that existed between the two communities as a result of the events of 55, 58, mostly part of 59, meant that the Republic was going on to a rough start from the very beginning, it was going to face difficulties. In the House of Parliament, the House of Representatives, there were going to be separate majorities. So when a bill went to the House, the Greek Cypriots would vote, and a majority was needed, and the Turkish Cypriot representatives would vote separately, and you needed a majority there. I mean, this was unique. I cannot think of a constitution that contained such elements. The explanation given by those that supported the arrangement was that, okay, these were difficult times, blood had been shed during the conflict, that there were these special circumstances that necessitated arrangements that would make, for example, the Turkish Cypriots as a minority feel safe, and that their rights were safeguarded. On the side of the Greek Cypriots, however, the feeling that prevailed, even though at the beginning there were the sort of celebrations and so on about, gaining independence and all that, it was from the beginning felt that this was overall first of all, a settlement that moved them away from this desire for enosis, but also was an unfair settlement as far as the Greek Cypriots were concerned. Here is the signing of the Treaty of Establishment of the Republic of Cyprus on the 16th of August. One can see the last governor, Sergiu Foot, Archbishop Macarios as president, leader of the Greek Cypriots, and Dr. Fazil Kuchuk, vice president, leader of the Turkish Cypriots. Here they were sort of officially welcome in their respective capacities, one as president and the other as vice president. And in this way, the Republic of Cyprus was established. You would have seen in the earlier picture that the signing was 16th of August. Cyprus Independence Day celebrated on 1st of October. In itself, the date hasn't got any significance. It was that 16th of August was considered a very inconvenient date. 15th of August is a very important religious holiday. Religious celebrations would take place. It's very hot in Cyprus, and it was thought that with all that this involved, it was better to move it further, and that's when they opted for 1st of October. Now, this republic has been described as a reluctant republic, and in many respects rightly so, in that the British secured what they wanted. They secured their sovereign bases in Tigelia and Akrotiri. They established various other privileges that would strengthen the protection of their interests, which were mostly military interests. And on the part of the Greek Cypriots, as I said, there was the feeling that this was forced on them and that the arrangements were not fair. The Turkish Cypriots, on one hand, had reason to celebrate. They gained more than one would say was fair. On the other hand, still suspicious, apprehensive, worried as to what their partners, the Greek Cypriots, would be doing, how they would be behaving in these new circumstances. It was an uneasy partnership where suspicion and divergent routes towards Greece and Turkey prevailed. The Greek Cypriots were looking towards Greece, the Turkish Cypriots towards Turkey, and this, in a sense, was the fact that the two sides had a mother country each, and this would dominate Cypriot politics and the relations between the two sides in the years that followed. It was made worse by the fact that there was hardly a Cypriot identity. The Greeks were saying that they were Greek Cypriots, so the strong element of Greekness and attachment to Greece. The Turkish Cypriots said they were Turkish Cypriots with attachment to Turkey. Over the years, even though the British had tried, as we saw in the period after 1931 especially, to create a kind of Cypriot identity, this had not been successful. What was the result? Very soon after the establishment of the Republic, problems began to arise in the implementation of even routine administrative measures. There were differences over taxation. There were differences over development of relations and so on a number of issues. That on the municipalities there was an issue. The constitution provided for separate municipalities in the big cities, but this created practical problems, and it was not possible to be effective, and it was not cost effective anyway, and friction began. Some things sort of created a stalemate. When the Greek Cypriot side insisted on unified municipalities, which the Turkish Cypriots did not want, they reacted by blocking legislation concerning taxation. The newly established state could not function without measures, laws regarding taxation. This led Macarios decide to propose a sort of revision of the constitution. These have become known as Macarios' 13 points, which he submitted for consideration to the Turkish Cypriots in November 1963. What were these proposals? Okay, one proposal was for unified municipalities, but municipal councils that would take into consideration the presence of the two communities. It provided that, for example, that the president would be in his absence, it would be substituted by the vice president. In a sense, these were measures, in the view of Macarios, that would make the state more functional and more effective. On the Turkish Cypriot side, however, they were seen as measures that were really giving more power to the majority, the Greek Cypriots, because it were working more towards the idea of a unitary state. And well, Macarios has been criticized as to the timing in particular of proposing these measures in an atmosphere that was still not conducive to such agreements. It's a fact that Turkey turned it down before even the Turkish Cypriots responded. And then it was not long afterwards, in December of that year, 1963, just before Christmas, that armed confrontation began. There are different views regarding this by different people, both within Cyprus and abroad, historians, politicians, and just common people. There are those who say that Macarios has a big share of the blame because of the 13 points which were presented at an inappropriate time. The other view is that, so that we can complete that point, and in that the 13 points were instrumental in bringing about the events of later in the year in December and the armed conflict. There is the other view that supports the fact that, okay, the state could not function properly and that some changes were necessary, and also point out that the Turkish Cypriots were actually getting ready to start an armed conflict guided by Ankara. This could go on. One could present different views. The fact was that this was the arrangements of 1959-60 were not so good. The constitution could lead to such conflicts. There was the fact that, yes, there was suspicion, there was this conflict in the background between the two sides, which of course was also made worse by the extremists on both sides, one could say, when they accused each other. And the fact, however, remains that just before Christmas there were violent incidents. There was what one could say an armed mutiny by the Turkish Cypriots. The Turkish Cypriots support that it was actually, they were forced into a defensive actions. The Turkish Cypriots withdrew from the government, so in a way the division of the island began in late 1963. There was fighting, and the British moved in, the international community, and in January 64, with a ceasefire, the green line was drawn that separated the two communities. We get the creation of what we call the enclaves in which Turkish Cypriots were enclosed. And in March 1964, UN peace force was set up to come to Cyprus, and in actual fact it has been here in Cyprus ever since, with a renewal of the mandate now it's twice a year. So these are some scenes from the fighting. At the time there was no army, so in effect here what you see is armed policemen and some civilians on the Greek side, Greek Cypriot side. Here you can see also it's near the line separating the two communities. This is Litra Palace. It was the scene of fighting. It is now where we have one of the checkpoints that was established after 1974. This is how Nicosia was divided. These are barricades that were erected in different parts of Nicosia, cutting off part of Nicosia from the rest. Something similar occurred in other big cities, in Limassol, in Paphos, and in Famagusta, where there was Turkish population in the city, Greek population, and they were cut off. The same happened in some of the villages. Some villages like Kofinu, like Gioneli, which were exclusively Turkish Cypriot, they were sealed off. And the republic, the government, had no authority for a number of years that followed up to the invasion. These were really sad events. The newly born republic was really shaken to its very foundations. The two communities separated, and the future looked uncertain. The fighting had stopped. There was now the sort of UN force in a way maintaining the peace on the island, but the problem had not actually been solved. UN Security Council Resolution 186 recognized the government led by Archbishop Macarios as the legitimate government of Cyprus. This is still the case, even after 1974 and after the declaration in 1983 of the so-called Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. It is still the government of the Republic that is recognized, and TRNC, as it is known, is only recognized by Ankara. In August 1964, there were further clashes between the two sides. A Turkish Air Force bombed Diliria, causing considerable destruction and killing. Turkey threatened with invasion, accusing the Greek Cypriots of attempting to victimize the Turkish Cypriots, and it was President Josso's warning to Turkey that actually averted it. There was support from the Greek government this time. There was the danger of a more general confrontation in the area, and of course the seriousness that the two NATO allies, Greece and Turkey, would come into conflict, weakening that wing of NATO at a time when more and more the Cold War was being more intensified. So this possibly explains there was a fear of armed confrontation between Greece and Turkey, which, as I just stated, would weaken NATO, which created apprehension in the West in relation to the what they consider to be the expansionist policies and the threat from the Soviet Union. There were attempts to provide some solutions. One such was the Acheson Plan, which, however, was rejected by Archbishop Macarios as president then of the Republic of Cyprus, believing that this really meant the partition of the island and was therefore not acceptable. A crucial event occurred in April 1967 with the military coup in Greece and the establishment of the military junta there. Right from the beginning, the junta was hostile to Archbishop Macarios for various reasons. One, they saw him as a threat to themselves. The Archbishop did not express support for the military government in Athens, and they were somewhat afraid of his influence in Greece and what he might do. Also, another reason and an accusation leveled against Macarios was that within Cyprus he was encouraging communism because of the relations, the relationship he had with the Communist Party again. This created strong feelings of opposition towards Macarios, and the military junta began to work out ways of removing Macarios. They also saw him as an obstacle to any solution. They were subjected to pressure by the United States. They needed the support of the United States, and they saw that Macarios was an obstacle to solving the problem in Cyprus. In November 1967, there was an incident in Kofinou, a village which was inhabited by Turkish Cypriots, and one cannot go into all the details. The fact was that the village was attacked by government forces because from there Turkish Cypriot fighters were preventing traffic on the main Nicosia-Limassol road, which was considered vital for the economy and so on. There are different views who was to blame for this. The fact was that it created tremendous tension. Turkey threatened with invasion again, and the Greek junta in effect capitulated by agreeing that Greek forces on the island would be removed, and that General Rivas, who had earlier assumed command of the Cyprus National Guard, that he should leave the island. The removal of the Greek forces was seen as really weakening the defense of Cyprus, and one would see in the events of 1974 when Turkey actually finally invaded Cyprus. Intercommunal talks began, so in that sense talks, negotiations in solving the Cyprus problem as it has come to be known date back to 1964. There were now also serious internal divisions amongst the Greek Cypriots, which were encouraged by the Greek junta. It made negotiations with the Turkish side more difficult. Relations between Archbishop Macarios and the military junta became worse and worse. In March 1970, there was the first attempt on the life of Archbishop Macarios, and in August, Rivas arrived in Cyprus and created EOKB, which had as an aim to fight Macarios and remove him. The conflict amongst the Greek Cypriots escalated. In 1972, there was an attempt by the three bishops to force Macarios to resignation. They presented to him that he could not be both an archbishop and a president, and that he had to choose. Of course, this was part of the internal divisions, because Macarios had been there from 1960, and the vast majority of the people, including those that were now asking him to resign, had supported this dual role. It was a sad development in that this move created a schism within the Greek Orthodox Church of Cyprus. Macarios worked his way through and out of this situation, but the division was there. In 1973, Macarios was re-elected president, and there was another attempt on his life. This leads us to the tragic year 1974. Towards the end of January, Rivas died. This had weakened EOKB. But what had happened in the 2 years so before was really sad, in that EOKB blew up police stations. They killed people that were considered Macarios supporters. On the other hand, those who supported Rivas and the EOKB accused Macarios of dictatorial measures, of the treatment their supporters received from the special forces created by Macarios. It's not the time here to apportion blame and share of responsibility, but one can certainly say that this could only have created joy amongst the Turkish Cypriots and the Turks in Ankara. The divisions amongst the Greek Cypriots were really weakening the Greek Cypriot side. And then came the tragic day of the 15th of July, when the coup against Macarios took place. As well known, the junta was involved in the coup with the OKB supporters and the Greek contingent that was in Cyprus since the establishment of the Republic. Macarios managed to escape, and he got out of the country to Malta and subsequently to London, and a kind of puppet government was set up under Nikos Samson, but his government was only to last a few days, because on the 20th of July, Turkey, taking advantage of the situation, accusing Greece of actually interfering and intervening in internal affairs of Cyprus, stating that the Turkish Cypriots were in danger, justified the invasion, using a clause in the constitution as a guarantor power that, according to them, had the right to intervene to restore constitutional order. This is important to remember, because even if that was so, and it's stated, then once the government, quotation marks, of Nikos Samson fell from power, Glavkos Kliridis took over as acting president, it was a move towards going back to constitutional order. However, the Turkish forces are still in Cyprus after so many years. On the 23rd of July, the military junta in Greece fell from power, and on the 14th of August, there was the second phase of the Turkish invasion, where the Turkish forces, which had landed in Kyrenia, moved towards Nicosia. They had created a bridgehead, moved eastwards towards Famagusta and westwards towards Morphu, and as a result, in a short period of time, they brought under their control 36.7, something like that, of the territory of Cyprus. Here we see a scene from the coup, the tanks moving. This is the archbishopric, which was attacked by the forces supporting the Greek junta, actually under the orders of the Greek military junta, against Macarios. This is the presidential palace after the attack. Inside, it was more or less completely destroyed. It was looted, and then the Turkish invasion started. Turkish forces advancing from the north in Kyrenia towards Nicosia, where they joined with the Turkish part of Nicosia, where the enclave was. And this is what we have since 1974, August 1974. You can see the territory under Turkish occupation. You can see the Attila line that separates, cuts Cyprus into two, and ever since 1974, the Cyprus problem, which had actually started in 1964, continues to the present. Some even say that the Cyprus problem started even earlier, going back to the early 50s. The fact is that Cyprus is now partly under Turkish occupation. The two communities are living apart, and there are attempts both within the country and the international community to find a solution which does not appear to come easily. This is the end of this second lecture. In the third and final lecture, I will be covering some more of the events of 1974, the consequences of the Turkish invasion and occupation, the attempts at finding a solution to the Cyprus problem, and the main events leading to the present. What follows is a select bibliography. It is by no means exhaustive. I have tried to select books that cover different aspects of the history of Cyprus, the medieval period, Ottoman rule, British rule, the early years of independence, and the events right up to the present. I believe it could offer different people books that would give them more information on topics they are interested in. Thank you.